Coming up, as COVID-19 cases surge, we check in with expert Dean Seneca for the latest updates. Plus, the documentary Remaining Native follows a young Native runner determined to bring awareness to the trauma of Indian boarding schools. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is a proud supporter of Indian Country Today. Students at Cronkite News and Gaylord College at the University of Oklahoma cover Indigenous communities together. This important work is distributed by more than 100 news organizations. This collaboration provides a much-needed boost to coverage of Native American communities nationwide. Learn more at cronkitenews.azpbs.org.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Amadawa Hopa. Thank you for joining the ICT Newscast. The age range of those eligible for COVID-19 booster shots has expanded. On Monday, the Food and Drug Administration announced children ages 12 to 15 are eligible for a booster shot from drug maker Pfizer. The FDA also announced everyone 12 and older who is eligible for a Pfizer booster can get one as early as 5 months after their last dose, rather than 6 months. Medical experts say boosters are important to reduce the spread of Omicron and other COVID-19 variants. Later this week, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is expected to decide whether to recommend boosters for even younger children. Tribal leaders in New Mexico are asking to be consulted before the U.S. government finishes its plans to build an electricity line through its sacred landscapes. Last year, the U.S. Energy Department announced its intent to build a 12-mile transmission line to bring higher electrical capacity to Los Alamos National Laboratory. In order to build the line, however, new structural towers would need to be built on both sides of a canyon near the Caja del Rio area. In December, Pueblo governors said they want to protect that area, which is home to petroglyphs, kivas, and other cultural resources. Federal officials said they will try to avoid known areas of significance. The project would also include new overhead poles that have an average span of 800 feet. In Washington state, the Squaxin Island tribe is getting some of its land back. In late December, Port Blakely companies returned 2 miles of ancestral land to the nation free of charge. The move comes as Indigenous advocates call for the return of land everywhere as part of the Land Back movement. Chris Peters is the chairman of the tribe, and he told the Seattle Times, quote, "I can't wait to drum and sing and dance out on those beaches, just like our people did hundreds and thousands of years ago. To me, it is a very spiritual thing. It fills my heart." The return now gives the tribal nation direct access to the Puget Sound. The tribe also agreed to purchase 875 acres of ancestral forest land from the same company. New York City's first health survey of Native residents is revealing the inequities they face. This first ever study by the city's health department highlights the conditions of more than 100,000 Indigenous peoples who live in New York. Those included were Native Americans and other Indigenous people from Central and South American countries. The report says that health and economic inequities are shown to increase the risk of exposure, infection, and death from COVID-19 among these groups. Chronic conditions like high blood pressure and diabetes were also more common among Indigenous people when compared to other racial groups. Well, sad news out of South Dakota. The Native American Women's Health Education Resource Center was lost during a string of early morning fires last week. The center was founded 35 years ago and has been a go-to location for community members. It provided Dakota language programming, meals, and after-school snacks for children. The building was also home to Dakota Talk Radio, broadcast on KDKO. After the fires, local resident Donovan Sully claimed responsibility for the fires and turned himself in to the Charles Mix County Sheriff's Office. Sharon Asatoyer is the center's chief executive. She says she's thankful that no one was injured in any of the fires and says the cost to rebuild will be several $100,000. A First Nations hockey player is making history in her profession. In late December, Bridget Laquette was hired as a scout for the Chicago Blackhawks. That move made her the first Indigenous woman to ever scout for a team in the National Hockey League. And it's not her first time making history. The Cote First Nations citizen was also the first Indigenous woman to make the hockey team for Team Canada. She competed in the 2018 Winter Olympics and earned a silver medal. Laquette says her skill has helped her in her new job to scout hockey players. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Coming up, a new documentary follows a runner paying tribute to his ancestors. But first, we hear from a native epidemiologist as we navigate a world with COVID-19. When many of us first heard about COVID-19, it was a mysterious new illness. Well, helping to keep us informed along the way has been epidemiologist Dean Seneca. He is the founder of Seneca Scientific Solutions and a professor at the University of Buffalo. He teaches about Indigenous health disparities and improving access to quality health care. Hi, Dean.
Hi, Leah. How are you?
I'm good. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, too.
So let's talk about all things COVID-19. I want to first start with case numbers. We just got over this long holiday break, and what we're seeing is a rise in cases across the nation. But what specifically in Indian country are you seeing right now?
Well, it's a tsunami. Along with the rest of the nation, cases are also rising throughout Indian country. For last week, for example, IHS reported about a weekly average of 2,500 new cases. As of this week, that number went up to 6,700. So we are definitely part of this tsunami that is happening throughout the country. Also to note, remember, our reporting systems are extra slow in Indian country. So my assumption is that those cases are much higher.
And is IHS differentiating between what kind of COVID-19 variants people have?
I've seen some tribal nations have the ability to differentiate between Omicron and Delta, but I've seen many more of our tribal nations that don't have that capability. So, it's a mix. That's a really big mixed bag there. But my assumption is that the increase that we're seeing throughout the country, the increase that we're seeing throughout Indian country, is related to the Omicron variant.
Sure. And on the topic of Omicron, so many scientists around the world are really studying what this does on a cellular level, what it does to our bodies. What do we know so far about Omicron in particular?
Well, I think what we're finding out, there's a couple things that are not being reported. Everyone is saying, well, Omicron is less severe than the other strains, and we're finding a little bit about that right now. So yes, we are seeing that it is less severe, but what we're also finding out that isn't being reported, that people are a little sicker longer, right? And this is very concerning, right? Especially as CDC has, changed its policy from a 10-day isolation to a 5-day isolation, right? Did they change that policy based on studies from the Delta variant and not really understanding Omicron? I think that's what happened. That's something that as a scientist, I can't agree with, because if people are staying sicker longer, that means that their infectious abilities to impact others is different, right? If they are less severe, that means that from Omicron, that means that the virus doesn't really kick in for a few days. And according to the change in the CDC policy, they're saying, well, we're able to detect people when they're sick early. And I would have to argue that's just not the case. So that is something of a major concern regarding what's going on policy wise related to Omicron. But there's a lot more that we need to know. For example, the studies in South Africa showed that, yes, there was huge increases when cases started to come down. They didn't come down immediately. They started to even out, meaning people are staying sick longer, meaning people are still infectious, right? So, there's a lot that we don't know yet, but, the data will be coming out regarding Omicron. Oh, the other thing that I think that we're going to see is, we're just seeing the beginning of this surge related to Omicron. I think, we're not really going to see spikes until, and, I hope I'm wrong, but probably the end of January, middle of February. So
And
we're
when
in
you
for a
say
battle.
spike, do you mean sort of the height of the curve? Is that what you mean?
That's exactly what I mean. Exactly that we're not going to see the height, where we are at the top of the peak and spike for you know until the end of January, beginning of February. Because think about it, we've seen the tsunami yet, but we haven't. And the reason why we saw that is because, as we know in this country, reporting and getting recorded cases is a very slow process. The reason why we saw this surge is because there's so many positives that it's just throwing the scale off. But we don't know how far that's gonna, how high that's gonna go as far as a peak, and we don't know all the other infections that are going on. Here's the other interesting thing with Omicron that we're seeing. It's also impacting people who are fully vaccinated, and people that are boosted are also getting Omicron. But here's the big thing. When they do get Omicron, it's just like a common cold. You're going to be out for 2 to 5 days. You might have a recovery of a maximum of 2 weeks, but you will be sick. What we are seeing, though, is an increase in hospitalizations related to Omicron, and specifically pediatric hospitalizations, which is a major, major concern right now during this, where we are in this pandemic.
I want to circle back to your earlier point. You talked about the CDC changing their guidelines on isolation from 10 days to 5 days if you test positive for COVID 19. A lot of the pushback, and this was a very controversial decision to make, a lot of the pushback, of course, was that a lot of people felt that more people needed to get back to work, that this was a decision to save the economy. Is that something that you agree with, or what are your thoughts on that?
Um, Actually, I don't agree with. I didn't like it moving from 16 days to 10 days, right? I didn't like that at all, and I couldn't find, the sense for doing that. No, first off, yeah, and I was saying this earlier, we don't create policy to mimic human behavior, right? We don't create health policy to mimic human behavior, i.e., no smoking in public places, right? We create health policy to change human behavior. That's why you do that, because you want to change the way people are behaving, right? And I just think moving from that 10 days to 5 days is a huge mistake. I really do. Because here's the thing: you cannot have a healthy economy if you don't have healthy people, right? And that's what we're seeing now, right? We're also seeing with this tsunami, many people not being able to go to work. 20% of this police department here in New York City, 50% of these healthcare workers at this hospital, which is creating a work shortage to even address the pandemic, but also creating a work shortage in order to keep the economy going. I mean, it makes no sense. You have to have healthy people for a healthy economy, right?
Sure. Well, the other thing that experts have said, of course, is that vaccination is so important at this point in the pandemic. In terms of Indian country, where are we at with vaccinations?
Well, I think in the very, very beginning, when there were a lot of reports out that we had the highest vaccination per racial ethnic group, I think at some points and in some communities we may have, you know, but I do know of a few instances and a few tribal nations where they were over-reporting their vaccinations, that our vaccinations were not that high, right? So yes, you know, in the very beginning, because Indian Health Service was on the ground, we were able to get our vaccinations rates pretty high in comparison to other racial ethnic groups throughout the country. But currently, right now, we're actually I just checked the CDC website, and the American Indian Alaska Native population is the lowest vaccinated, broken down by racial ethnic group. You know, the Asian community is actually very highly vaccinated. The African American community is highly vaccinated with rates of 92 and 80. And I think, you know, for our American Indian Alaska Native population, we're like at 72%. Again, you know, I would have to say that is a questionable number. I really don't see, especially given our spikes in cases, what's going on in Indian country, that our vaccination rates are that high. I'm hoping they're that high, but there's just a lot of questions about the incompleteness of the data.
Sure. Well, Dean Seneca, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure and great doing this interview with you guys.
When we come back, we hear from a Native director and producer about her new documentary called Remaining Native. Stay with us. Paige Bethmann is a director and producer based in New York City. Over the last 10 years, she has worked in nonfiction television for companies like Vox, Facebook, YouTube Originals, and NBC. Paige is now using her talents to direct her first feature-length documentary called Remaining Native. It explores the legacy and impacts of Indian boarding schools that existed in the U.S. for over 150 years. And she joins us now to share more. Hi, Paige.
Hi.
Well, let's take a look at your trailer.
I was raised in a sweat lodge, you know, in that kind of atmosphere, going to bear camp each year, going to Sundance each year. And, you know, those are hard Native things. I've always just been Native.
Ku was a fun little kid. He liked to run. When it was maybe 4 or 5, there was a kid's like half mile and sprinted it. He was just fast.
On your marks.
You know, they always told me your legs are gonna take you places.
Cross country champion for the state of Nevada 2021.
I just wish it could have happened sooner. We just didn't have the resources. I could just imagine my people out here, you know, and what they had to go through, and the odds of me being here right now, it's crazy.
Grandpa was Frank Quinn. He was born in 1905. When he was 8 years old, he was stolen from his family and taken to Stewart. He rebelled. He left 3 times as a little boy.
Authorities in Canada have uncovered the remains of 215 children at the site of a former residential school for Indigenous students.
I saw the announcement of the children in Canada.
I just thought of my great-grandfather. How could an 8-year-old do that? Cross over mountains 50 miles a couple of days. It's just unthinkable.
With all of the news coming out, we needed to come together and try and help. So we decided to do it, running from Stewart to Yerington, like his grandpa.
I want to thank all of you, really, because this has been a dream of me and my dad's for a while. And by you being here, every single one of you, you're fulfilling that. And it's something that it's needed. It's just not that simple, you know? It's a lot deeper than that. And a lot of people don't know that at all.
Today I don't wanna wake up, I just wanna die. Wonder why my people suffer, why these kids are getting high. They're getting drunk, and we're broke, and we're barely getting by. I should tell them how I feel, I should stop being so shy.
Paige, tell us why it was important to tell the story of Ku Stevens.
Yeah, so I've worked in media and journalism for the last 10 years, and as an Indigenous filmmaker, there's just not enough of our own stories out there, especially when it comes to our past. And when the news broke in Kamloops this year, my reaction, was really emotional. Mostly because I was so frustrated with the lack of awareness that my, fellow colleagues and just, friends had, because they did not know this history. And I felt like it was almost a responsibility. My grandmother growing up told me about her mother's experiences in boarding school. She was taken to a boarding school when she was just 10 years old and was there for over 9 years. And so I felt, it was my responsibility to be able to do something similar to Ku, which is, he was raising awareness by bringing running to his community and, doing this event to honor his great grandfather. And I wanted to do a similar thing by being able to create a film to tell these stories and, just have it through an Indigenous perspective, which is something that I don't think we get to see very often in mainstream media.
Sure. I think we hear that narrative so often on our newscast talking about Indigenous people who, as you mentioned, just one generation or two generations ago, have stories of relatives who lived this very traumatic history. I want to ask you about Ku and maybe the first time that you learned about him.
Yeah. So when when the news broke, I was just looking online and I was, coming across different stories and just kind of seeing what, different communities were doing and how they were reacting. And a friend of mine had shared an article from a local newspaper from the Reno Gazette Journal. And I just read his story and I was, really moved by it. Not only because I felt, I could relate to Ku, but also just because the visuals as a filmmaker looking at that story and seeing like that he was going to make this 50-mile journey across the desert, I just felt like could be a very powerful way to be able to tell his story. And so I just reached out to him as a stranger. I actually reached out to his mom on Facebook because she was organizing the Remembrance Run, and I just wrote her this really long emotional message and just said how much I would love to come out and meet them and film the story. And they were just so welcoming. And we got on the phone and we talked for a long time. And, both of our goals was to be able to raise awareness for the Indian boarding schools and also, do it in a really beautiful way. And so, we went out there and met them, and we just have been kind of friends ever since, continuing working on this project.
Sure. And I want to actually talk about that project. Tell us about when you envisioned this documentary premiering and what step in the process of filming and production are you in right now?
Yeah, so essentially the film is going to follow Ku from, this past August from the Remembrance Run through when he goes to college, which is this August. So he's a senior in high school right now. And so we are planning on following him as well as the federal investigation that's going on. And Deb Haaland, the Interior Secretary, her report's coming out in April, May. That's when Ku is meant to graduate. So it's really following these two storylines in this like parallel way. And so In terms of the editing and when it's actually going to be premiering, that's to be determined. We're hoping for it to premiere in 2023 to really, take the time to, make sure that we're telling a very nuanced and, powerful story.
Sure. Well, my last question really is going to be what you hope that this documentary invokes in people. Is it a conversation? Is it empathy? What does that look like for you?
I think there are a lot of different things. I think, for indigenous people, everyone's healing looks differently. So I want them to, watch this and decide for themselves, what they want to take away from that, whether that's being inspired by Ku or just being able to have the conversation with their family members who might have a similar history. And for, non-native people, I really want this to be an opportunity for them to, learn about it and to ask questions and even question themselves and how they partake in systemic racism and be able to, not just look at the trauma, but to be able to look at the resiliency that the story, really highlights.
Sure. Paige Bethmann, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Thank you for watching. For all the latest news and updates, visit us anytime at IndianCountryToday.com. I'm Aaliyah Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.